Today I'm going to respond to Caleb's challenge to me specifically about movie musicals. The way that I'm going to specifically do this is talk about 2 adaptations that weren't done well, 2 adaptations that were, and then wrap it all up with my final thoughts. First, the bad. And when it comes to infamously bad things that have happened lately, I need to start with Cats 2019. Now, I have mentioned before that I don't like Cats the musical. I'm only bringing it up here just to mention that I don't have as much of a knowledge about this show, so I will do my best to talk about it fairly, but there still might be occasional lapses of judgment. So I mentioned back when I talked about this movie that I really enjoyed it, but it's certainly not because it's a good movie, let alone it being a good adaptation. Firstly, they added a plot that just wasn't there before. Now, this obviously makes sense because the original Cats didn't really have much of a plot to speak with, and when you go to see a movie, you kind of expect to have one of those. The problem here is that I feel like they didn't put that much thought into said plot. It's like they met for one meeting and just kind of knocked out a rough draft and then said, that's good enough. I know you don't necessarily have a lot to work with, but you are the ones that decided to adapt this to the movies in the first place. Maybe put just a little more thought into it next time. Or maybe just accept the fact that it's already in the medium where it needs to be and that you should just keep it there, as Ryan George pointed out in the pitch meeting for the Cats movie, which I highly recommend watching. Secondly, they made some changes to the music for no discernible reason. The most egregious example of this would have to be Mungo Jerry and Rumpelteazer. Now, I didn't know this when I first watched it, but they fully changed the melody. Abbey, on the other hand, did know, and after we watched it, they played me a little bit of the original, and it was so much better.
Mungo Jerry
and Rumpelteazer,
we're a notorious couple of cats. Let's knock about clowns,
quick change comedians,
tightrope walkers,
and acrobats.
Mungo Jerry
and Rumpelteazer,
we're a notorious
couple of cats. As knockabout clowns, quick change comedians, tightrope walkers, and acrobats.
I'm not sure why they felt the need to change it, because it didn't really seem to add anything to the overall quality of the movie. It seemed to be just different for the sake of being different, and that's never a good enough reason. Finally, this show is a visual one. Obviously, most shows are, that's how they work, but this one especially. Since there's not really a plot, most of the focus is on the dancing and the costumes. I would say that's probably where the appeal is. If you know anything about this movie, then you know exactly where I'm going with this. This movie looks terrible. The main characters aren't quite cats, but they're also not quite people. They are fused abominations of the two. Like the Amalgamates from Undertale, except somehow more terrifying. And the Amalgamates were trying to be terrifying. And because of how this movie was made, the bodies of the actors were pretty much covered up by CG, so any impressive dancing that would be there, and I have no doubt that there is some because they did hire actual dancers, is completely covered up by the animation. When the two things the musical's got going for it are completely thrown out the window, you know you've got a bad adaptation. The next movie that I'm going to talk about is about a musical that I do know quite a bit about, The Fantasticks. When I first heard there was an adaptation of The Fantasticks with Joel Grey, I was pretty excited because, you know, Joel Grey. Now, Joel Grey was good, but the rest of the movie? Absolutely not. Now, I can't get into everything that I hate about this movie because we're already almost at a page of writing, and we're not even halfway through the video yet, so I will do my best to boil everything down into 3 points. Number 1, the actors aren't great. There are obviously exceptions, Joel Grey among them, of course. But of the 4 main people that this musical is about, so the 2 lovers, Matt and Louisa, and then the 2 fathers, he is the only one that is. The lovers are particularly bad, which, considering they are kind of the main part of the show, being the titular Fantastics after all, the movie does suffer for it. Number 2, there are just a lot of unpleasant visuals. I never thought that Cats and Fantastics would have something in common, but here we are. The original show is very minimal. Purposely so. So, in the stage show, in the second act, when terrible things are happening to Matt, it's very stylized and not at all realistic. In the movie, very realistic and wildly unpleasant to watch. Also, because they changed the way that the story is being told, which is something that I will get into in just a moment, it meant that Matt saw that Louisa was there watching all of this happen. In the stage production, because of the stylization, while Louisa is there watching, she's also kind of separate in a way, and so he never notices that she's there. In the movie, he does, and he calls out to her weekly while he's being tortured. Not fun, and not necessary. This is only one example. I think it's definitely the worst example, but there are just also other moments that are just not pleasant to watch. Third, this movie fundamentally changes the way that it tells the story. In no way is this more apparent than in the character of El Gallo. In the original stage show, this is essentially a group of actors putting on a show. So it made sense that El Gallo is able to be in the show, but also separate from it, talking to the audience. It also makes sense why he sticks around in the second act. El Gallo in universe is hired by the fathers to stage an abduction so that the lovers can get together, and the fathers can end this feud that they've been fabricating so that the lovers could get together. In the second half of the show, Matt and Louisa find out about this ruse and confront El Gallo. It doesn't go particularly well, and then Matt leaves. Since he's the main narrator of the musical, it makes sense that he would continue to stick around. It's also implied that he's actively trying to help these two families. In the movie, we get none of that, because this isn't a troupe of actors telling the story, it's just a story that's actually happening. So El Gallo sticks around because he's kind of an asshole, I guess? There's also a moment in the movie, in the song I Can See It, where El Gallo actively lures Matt out of his house, and then talks about how he shouldn't be leaving his house. In the musical, this song happens because Matt has already left to explore the world. So El Gallo sings the song in an attempt to warn him, but it's a warning that falls on deaf ears. The movie, for some reason, after the confrontation, Matt goes home, and so El Gallo basically lures him out of the house and then reprimands him for leaving the house. It's a shame, because I think Jonathan Morris honestly does a good job with this character. But because of how this story is rewritten, his character is just an asshole that likes manipulating people. He also spends most of this movie not talking to the audience, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, he sings a song directly to the audience. It's jarring, to say the least, considering the rest of the movie spends most of the time actively trying to not be the musical. Overall, I think Fantastics is a story that could work in movie form, but a lot more thought would have to be into it, and honestly, I think it should just stay in musical form, because that is very much where this story shines. Finally, we move on to the next part, a couple of stories that adapted really well to movies. First, we have Chicago. Chicago really lends itself well to the movie style of storytelling. It's already a spectacle kind of show, seeing as how that's Billy Flynn's whole thing. That spectacle can very easily translate to screen. And it very much did in this version of Chicago, as it switches between what's actually happening and the more stylized spectacle. A couple of examples just to show what I mean. Mr. Cellophane, the song sung by Amos Hart, one of two good people in Chicago, switches between the meeting between Amos and Billy, where Billy is piling a bunch of bad news onto Amos, most of it fabricated, and Amos applying clown makeup and then performing to an empty audience in full clown regalia. Amos is being played for a fool, and the spectacle shows that. And then we have We Both Reached for the Gun, the song that Billy sings in an attempt to paint the story of Roxy Hart being innocent. It cuts between the press conference where this all takes place and Billy literally puppeting everyone. We see him puppeting Roxy, which we also see in the original stage production, that being the main point of the song, but we also see him puppeting the reporters. Billy is playing everyone, and the spectacle shows that. It's a really impressive way to do it. Also, everyone in this cast is just really good, and especially after seeing the Fantastics, that's really nice to see. When it comes to choosing a musical to adapt, you have to really consider what is going to easily translate to this very different medium. Chicago does well, as does the next show that I'm going to talk about, Godspell. Godspell already exists in kind of a nebulous space. There's no clear location or time that it takes place in, so you can choose to place it wherever or whenever you want. And I think New York City is a really great place to put it. One of the major changes between the original stage musical and the movie is the removal of Prologue Tower of Babel. This makes sense, as this song isn't the most visually interesting one. The basic premise of the prologue is that the 8 cast members who aren't Jesus or Judas play 8 different philosophers. They all state their personal philosophies separately, and then they all sing at the exact same time, leading to a lot of cacophonous noise. This is purposely not great to listen to, and it signifies not just how separate these 8 individuals are, but also just kind of the general chaos of humanity. It's used to contrast what these 8 individuals come by the end of the show, one singular community. But this is just 8 people standing around singing. It works in the stage show because the cast can go out into the audience and sing directly to somebody. But it doesn't really work in movie form, so it makes sense to cut it. What the movie does do, since it takes place in New York City, is it just shows us these 8 individuals going about their daily lives. We see the chaos that is New York City, and it's able to accomplish the same goal. It's honestly a pretty brilliant way to make the idea of the prologue more visually interesting. Placing it in New York City also emphasizes the other kind of nebulous idea of the show, that it takes place out of time. There's an actual place here because that's more visually interesting for a movie, but they're able to show that there's not a specific time by having these 10 people walk around New York City completely alone. So we're able to see all of these iconic locations, but with only these 10 people, which can be a bit apocalyptic, but I always looked at it as just showing the timeless nature of the show. There are other changes to the original show, as you would expect from an adaptation, but none of them feel detrimental to the original story. None of them seem like they were just making changes for the point of making changes. And finally, the cast is all good, which is especially good considering what kind of show Godspell is. So, there you have it. 2 bad adaptations and 2 good adaptations. It is possible to take a musical and successfully adapt it to a movie. But you really have to stop and consider what show it is you're going to choose to adapt and whether or not you can. Some of them truly only work on the stage, and that's okay. Some stories are already in the medium where they need to be. But if you feel that you can adapt it, and you actually want to beyond just wanting to make a bunch of money, then by all means go for it. I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with adaptations. I've talked about on this channel in the past. But I do think there is a right way and a wrong way to do so. But I'm curious as to what you think. Do you agree with my choices? Do you disagree with my choices? Do you have any other movie musicals that you felt should have been talked about? Go ahead and let me know down in the comments, and to my friends and fellow VEDSies, I will see all of you